Good morning. My name is Betsy Corcoran, and I'm CEO and co-founder of EdSurge, and we're really delighted to have you here with us today to have a conversation around what it takes to really make EdTech effective. And we have a terrific panel of folks with us today. A quick note before we start, this webinar will be recorded and the recording made available after the live event, and you can rewatch it or share it with friends. We also are going to encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A box. There's a button down in the Zoom webinar window, and we're going to take questions as we go along. So please feel free to join in the conversation and ask some questions. Finally, I'd very much like to thank Newsela, who is the sponsor of today's webinar, for their deep interest both in SEL and in EdTech efficacy. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to dive in. Today we're joined by Malvika Bhagavat. She's a senior, leads all the research efforts at Newsela. She's currently leading 8 efficacy projects and spends a lot of time analyzing data to understand how students are learning. And in her earlier roles, Malvika has worked on assessment studies, assessment design studies across India, the US, Gulf countries, and has been a teacher in communities where there is low supplemental education services. She was also on the founding team for MindSpark, an English language learning program for children in India, and holds a master's degree from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Doug Casey is executive director of the Connecticut State Commission for Education Technology. And as director for this program, he both designs and manages strategic plans that are aimed at successfully integrating technology into Connecticut schools, libraries, universities, towns, and the program oversees really a whole range of statewide programs, including its flagship research and education broadband network, which is called CEN. And finally, Jen Stack is a professional development manager at Leap Innovations in Chicago. She creates and facilitates professional learning for educators as they improve their understanding and their implementation of personalized learning in classrooms and schools. She was previously an instructional coach at the New Teacher Center, coaching first and second year teachers in the Chicago public schools. So this is fantastic. We've actually managed to cover the entire country. Doug on the East Coast, Jen smack in the middle of the country, and Malvika, and for that matter, me, out here in California. So let's take a moment and look at how educators have felt about efficacy. A few years ago, the research group SRI put together a report called Using Technology and Evidence to Promote Cultures of Education Innovation. And it said, it's tough, right? The task of deciding what technologies to use is more challenging as there are more choices. And in fact, with this whole array of things, people have more choices than they have time to investigate. So that leads us to another question, which is, where are people getting their information from? So there was a 2014 report from Digital Promise that said, guess what? People are asking their peers. This idea has been echoed in a follow-up report from 2015 called Teachers Know Best that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation ran, and it was echoed again in 2017 at a symposium on efficacy that was convened by the Jefferson Education Exchange. So if we're relying on our peers, is that really how we're getting the best information on efficacy? And is that the information that's going to be most relevant to our individual schools and our communities? Now let's look at the other side of the coin. What are EdTech companies? How are they thinking about things? Well, that same SRI report pointed out that companies in the EdTech space want to make claims that their products are going to enhance individuals' functioning and basically that it's going to help learning. That's why so many companies get into the business. But is it really the case? How do we know? How do schools know? And do we agree on those things? Those are going to be some of the things that we're going to talk about in this panel. Before we get totally started, we want to actually ask you, the folks who are participating in this webinar, yes, that's all of you, millions of people, but we want to ask you guys a couple of quick questions. So you're going to see a pop-up poll right now on your screen. We'd love for you to weigh in. Question number one is, if you have been involved in choosing an EdTech product, did you have a third party's measure of efficacy? Did you have something like that? Did it factor into your decision? So yes, no, or, you know, that wasn't relevant in your case. Second question is, have you been involved in an EdTech pilot? That's an easy yes or no. The third question is, have you had the experience that a product that another school leader recommended to you worked for them, but didn't work for you? And then finally, the fourth question is, are you confident in how you measure the efficacy of EdTech tools that your school is using? It says host and panelists can't vote. I have a message on my screen, Zach, that says host and panelists can't vote. Okay, so we don't get to vote, guys. You get to vote. So we'll take another minute or two. Okay, great. So do we have the results from that poll? Aha. All right, so as a starting point, 20% of you said that yes, you've used some form of efficacy. Slightly more said no, and a whole bunch of folks have said, gosh, that wasn't relevant, which to my mind means that you didn't have a third party's measure of efficacy that was relevant. Have you been involved in an EdTech pilot? 2/3 of you have. That's fantastic. Have you had the experience that someone said it would work, but it didn't, and you're absolutely split? And then how much confidence do you have in a measure of efficacy? And clearly many people don't. And that's why we're talking today. So Doug, let's jump into this question. You have this burgeoning collection of innovation clusters in Connecticut, and your schools are using something like 70 EdTech products. So talk a little bit about how you're answering this question. How are those companies talking about efficacy? How are you talking about efficacy with them?
Sure. Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, it's interesting. I was just looking through the news this morning and saw the story about NeuroCore and being pressured to back down from some of its claims on how effective its software is for students with ADHD and other conditions. So obviously efficacy is a question that that is important and that that people need to take seriously. So in Connecticut, we are, as you mentioned, starting up an innovation cluster, and we've got approximately 70 EdTech companies in a relatively small state. And so having spoken with those companies and doing outreach with them, trying to get a sense of how they, as providers of EdTech, go about proving efficacy, it was, conducted some interesting research. And what I learned was that a lot of these companies don't necessarily have the resources. They're smaller, they're starting up, so they don't necessarily have the resources to conduct heavily research-based rapid cycle evaluations. They are excited about working with our local school districts to explore pilots and look at measures of efficacy. But in general, a lot of these companies are looking for sort of more narrow efficacy studies and/or looking at building efficacy into their products. So building in those feedback loops so that they're collecting in most of the time it's anonymized data around impact on students, and often they're building tools right into their products so that they can hear back from educators and students. So I think if you look at innovation in technology for education, you've got that sort of core teaching and learning solution delivery, but even within that, you've got this whole realm of developing feedback loops and developing vehicles for collecting and sharing efficacy. So, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface with what's possible, but it's exciting work that's going on here in Connecticut.
One quick follow-up on that, Doug. So among those 70 companies then, particularly if they're starting to look, if they're trying to have narrower definitions, is there consensus about what the efficacy goals are, and how are teachers feeling about that?
That's a good question. I think it kind of goes back to there needing to be a partnership between the school districts and the companies. And I think going into any type of implementation with education technology, there needs to be a dialogue and a mutual understanding of what does efficacy look like. Obviously, it's going to depend on the challenge that you're undertaking. And I think oftentimes that question of efficacy doesn't necessarily get delved into as much as it should be. And I think that leads to oftentimes a lot of sort of churn and spin in EdTech, where I've seen both as a district leader as well as speaking to a lot of other district leaders, a lot of try it quickly, abandon it, try it, abandon it. And I think really taking the time to look at what do we as a district want to get out of this, what are our challenges, and really sort of kicking the tires and testing multiple solutions to make sure that you're coming up with something that is hitting the mark, and working really closely with that provider to make sure that you are working together toward that goals. These are maybe tough questions, digging questions that you want to pose to your EdTech providers, but those should be the questions that leaders of EdTech companies get really excited about, because it only helps them get better too.
Yeah, good. So a lot of points to dive into there. Jenna, I want to move to you. You're in Chicago. You've been at LEAP. You have been designing pilots. Give us a quick overview. First, tell us a little bit about, how many schools and products have you guys worked with over the last couple of years? And then how are you reaching conclusions about efficacy? Are you finding that you have similar definitions? Well, let's just start with that. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure. So in Chicago, we have worked with about 120 schools, 118 schools to be specific, through the pilot process. And we've worked with 22 EdTech products through the four full cohorts that we've gone through at this point. And LEAP conducts yearly efficacy studies for the products using the standardized testing results from the students. And so we curate a suite of products for schools to select from, and our biggest support area is around making informed decisions about which EdTech product is going to work best for the schools. And so once the schools have selected an EdTech product, what we ask them to do is use the product with fidelity according to the product, and then we, at the end of the year, are able to run evaluations and efficacy studies around the effects of the products.
And are you finding, come back to that question of definition. So as you said, you're using standardized tests to say, are people going up or down? Is that what you're finding is the most useful measure of efficacy, or you also focus enormously on being a student-focused, student-centered, student inquiry-centered, pedagogical model? How does that factor into those standardized tests and the measure of efficacy?
Yeah, so I would say that the learner-centered model that we use has a big impact in the beginning of the selection of the EdTech tool for teams. And so we ask teams to identify different problems that they'd like to solve for in their schools. And then they look through the suite of products that we have curated. And we ask them to really think about, similar to Doug's point of setting goals for your school. And so looking at the products and thinking about if the product product meets the goal, if the school and team of teachers would be able to meet the fidelity requirements of the product, because we want to make sure that they're using it with fidelity to make sure that efficacy studies are in fact accurate. And then does the product make sense for the students at this time? That's the biggest portion of our decision making and our structures to help support teams in making decisions. And then we also ask them to mini pilot the products. So they get to select a few products from our suite, and they have about 4 weeks to pilot those products and see, does the data that comes from the products meet our needs? Does the student interface work well for students? Does it meet our goals? And so we really ask them to dive into the products and see which one that would be the best fit for their school for the following entire school year.
Great. Again, a lot of interesting clues there. We're going to come back to some of those, and I'm going to put a question to Malvika, and then we're going to start jumping in and also answering some of the questions that are coming from people who are participating here. Malvika, you wrote this great piece recently on EdSurge, and you said that simply asking, does it work, isn't really good enough. And you guys have taken millions of students now through Newsela, and you're looking at an awful lot of research and data points. So what do you mean that it's not enough to just say, does it work? What are you really learning from all these data points?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to build a little bit on what Jen and Doug already said. So in my mind, the questions of does it work or is it good are just dangerous questions to be asking. These questions quickly introduce personal opinion of people. They introduce conversations which are very subjective instead of being hard data points. And what we end up missing, or what we end up masking in these conversations, is information like, who does it work for? How often do I need to use it for it to actually work? How much professional development is needed? How much time do I need to put it? And what does it even mean to work? Work could have several definitions, but is it really aligning with the needs of the district or the students when we say it works? And the risk of masking all these questions or answers to these questions is really that you might be putting products in front of students that are inherently just not built for them. And that could be for several reasons. It could be because they were designed to serve a different age group. It could be because they were designed for a different demographic or a racial profile, or simply because the core area of that product is very different from the needs of the students in the district. So I think unpacking those questions and going deeper is the only way to make efficacy not just an academic exercise, but making it a more actionable data point into district conversations when buying products and trying to overcome that choice that they have, which is overwhelming, and making sure that the students have the best chance to success.
So I love that point. We've talked a lot at EdSurge about how if you said to me, what shoe do you recommend? I might recommend a hiking boot, or I might recommend a little strappy sandal. But if you're going hiking, you really don't want to hear about the strappy sandal. If you're going ballroom dancing, you really don't want to hear about the hiking boot. And so that question of how do you match the need with the tool is really critical. So you guys have teed up some really interesting points. Let me dive into a couple of quick questions that we've gotten online, and then we're going to kind of go a little deeper. First, Doug, you had mentioned that there are various companies building tools. Just go a moment deeper into the mechanics of this. Are the companies actually having to get active consent from the users? Do you do that as a district? Is that part of it? Jen, I presume that at LEAP, you're the ones who are responsible for getting all of the permissions set up from the school districts that are participating. But Doug, what are you doing in Connecticut?
Sure, I'll jump in on this. It's a really, really good question, and I think it ties into the broader concerns about data usage and privacy. So obviously, we've read a lot and heard a lot about data and privacy, even just in our own lives, about our finances and who's, infiltrating our personal information. I think oftentimes people forget that there's so much good that comes out of data collection and usage if done really responsibly and stewarded well. That all said, to answer the question, it does depend on the company, but those kinds of transparent articulations should come up in a master service agreement and or a data handling agreement that should be part of the review of the product. So I think it's a really, really good question. I think that any company that is actively collecting and reporting on data, even if it's anonymous, to make the product better, should be articulating those kinds of things. And those are the kinds of sort of transparent statements that you should be seeing in those master agreements or data handling agreements. So not a wholesale yes or no, but generally we're seeing those kinds of articulations in those statements.
Right, right. And then another attendee, Jen, question for you. When you talk about fidelity, how much do you mean what the producer, what the company that built the tool meant versus, gosh, does it turn out that there are changes to the teaching practices? And are there ways that teachers can actually influence even the design of those tools? So talk a little bit more about what you mean by fidelity. And how that factors into the success of some of those pilots that you're running.
Sure. So different companies actually have different definitions of fidelity. And so we try to honor the different companies' expectations for fidelity. And so I would say it's a yes and response to the question from the participant, that we really do we do recommend the fidelity usage that is recommended by the company, but also we look for quality of implementation, quality of the use of the data as well. So we ask EdTech companies to come into our schools and meet with the teams of teachers to really help them understand what the data is and how to use the data to best inform future instruction using the product.
Okay, great. I want to go back.
Really quick.
Go for it.
Yeah, something else I want to say about fidelity is ideally good fidelity of implementation accounts for the teacher needs in a classroom as well and is not developed in isolation. Your product will only work if the teachers can use it with the device access that they have, with the time that they have on hand. Making a recommendation in silo doesn't mean effective usage. And if in internal data testing as a product, if you're seeing that only a very tiny percentage, like single digit or very double digit, but at the lower end is implementing your product at fidelity, it probably means that as a product, you need to rethink what fidelity really looks like, or you're targeting a different use case.
That's a great point. And I'd love to pick up on the earlier point that you made as well, which is, again, not every tool is going to work in every classroom for every student, et cetera. When you and I've talked, we've talked about how narrowly should we be asking whether a tool works. So talk a little bit, and I'd love to have Jen and Doug jump in on this as well. How narrowly should we be thinking about, is this what this particular student needs? Is this what this particular group of students needs? Is this what this particular class? How tightly should we be asking the question of whether, a tool is making an impact? What's the grain size, the population size?
Yeah, I think that really depends on the conversation piece that happens between the district and the educator company, or the school and the EdTech company. The reason I say this is I think the solution that you're trying to bring into your classroom needs to fit the demographics and the needs of the students that you have in your classroom. If you have only one demographic group or one age group, then it can be as narrow as just that. And the question can be, does this work for fifth grade students? But if you have a fifth grade classroom with a very diverse set of learners and multiple ranges in terms of their reading abilities or literacy gains, then you're asking slightly different questions. You're not just asking, does this work for fifth grade students? You're asking, does this work for fifth grade students who are white? Does this work for fifth grade students who are Hispanic or Indian origin? And then also, does this work for students at different reading abilities or math abilities based on the product?
Right. So Doug and Jen, what do you see in your schools? First off, do you have any classes that are truly homogeneous anymore? Or, how again, tightly, narrowly, do you think you can usefully ask this question?
I think, from my perspective at the state level, I'm not necessarily going in and running implementations, et cetera. I can, maybe to tee this up a little bit, because sometimes these statements can be sort of without basis. I leverage some really interesting data that was done last year showing that a survey of 73 schools, 36,000 students using 7 pretty well-known literacy and K-12 products. 35% of the licenses were never activated. 24% were activated but never met any goals. 32% met a quarter or a half the goals, and only 9% of those products ever met all the goals. And that ties back into Malvika's point earlier about fidelity. I mean, sort of, you know, it's like if a doctor says, here's your medicine, and you take it once a day and you should be taking it 3 times a day, you can't, you know, it's hard to gauge efficacy. So I think looking at this from a sort of data perspective, there does seem to be more of a systemic wide-ranging challenge when it comes to fidelity of usage, and I think that's context for taking it down to sort of the classroom level, and where do you want to look at measurement and deployment of pilots. We keep putting more and more on to teachers. It's a challenge balancing all those different responsibilities, I would say, even especially at the elementary level.
Right. Jen, I guess 2 questions. One is, you obviously are very focused on the fidelity question. Do you feel that you're getting more fidelity of implementation than Doug just described in the study that he saw? Or do you, you know, I'm just really interested in whether you see anything comparable to the kinds of, quite honestly, horrifying statistics that he just shared, which is, you know, most of the tools aren't really being, you know, a good portion of the third aren't being used, maybe a third are meeting a quarter of the goals, and only 9% are meeting all of the goals. Do you see anything, do you see that's comparable to that in the work that you guys have done?
I would say that we definitely see a variety. So probably similar to some of the statistics that Doug just shared. But we also do, because we have relationships with the schools, and we have instructional coaches in the schools on a biweekly basis, that we are able to support teachers in starting the usage and starting to use the product. And so I would say that by mid-year, we're seeing more fidelity of the tools because we're able to, we have agreements with the products to share data with us and understand who's using the product and how much they're using it, how much they're meeting their goal, how much students are meeting the goals. And if they're not, then we can have follow-up conversations with them. So it's really about supporting the teachers who may be struggling with implementing a different EdTech tool, because to Doug's point, schools are flush with EdTech tools at this point.
Mm-hmm. The point that you made earlier, Doug, too, and Malvika, I think you sort of alluded to this. You talked about maybe there are smaller studies, something other than a gold standard of efficacy studies. What has been your experience about what's you know, either a tool, a standard that would show something valuable? How far can we go away from that ideal of the gold double-blind standard?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that as a first. I think ESSA recently released something that would answer this pretty well. So ESSA has 4 tiers, tiers 1 through 4, and it's designed for companies at various stages of development. And the first step is really simple. It's just having a logic model or a rationale, like a theory of change for companies. And all that's saying, if you think of it as a science experiment, it's saying, what is your hypothesis of change? Which seems like a fair starting point that any company should be able to show, and any district should be able to ask, or a teacher should be able to ask of a product. And then as you go up the ladder, depending on the number of years you've been in classrooms, you might start doing more internal data analytics, and then moving to what might be the gold standard of a third-party efficacy study. So they're steps, and as long as a company is showing progress and you're in the journey with them with progress, I think that's fair, because you also don't want to see a third-party efficacy study on a product that's brand new and has only been in a classroom for 3 months. That's a product that's just barely starting, and they're trying to figure out what they are and who they're best serving, and that doesn't make for a great efficacy study either. In terms of resources, I think a lot of companies are now, like a lot of research organizations are also shaping themselves to match the needs of EdTech and respond to this quick need for rapid cycle evaluations. Some that come to mind are Empirical Education has some services that they're doing for products, Learn Trials and Learn Platform, which I know Doug mentioned prior that they're using it as well. Digital Promise has a framework, Leap has a model. Like there are a bunch of people that are coming up now, New School Venture Funds through WestEd, like there are a bunch of them, and I think people are now responding to this. So it's catching up, it's new, but I think these resources are coming up and it doesn't have to be as expensive as it used to be at some point to do an efficacy study.
Mm-hmm. Great. Doug, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, not a lot. Just to tag team on to what Malvika said. I think if you're looking for something that's maybe a more nimble model, Malvika mentioned our use of the Learn platform in Connecticut. So thinking about some of the tools that are in that and other platforms that allow teachers to share efficacy data with each other. So in the era of peer-to-peer sharing, looking not necessarily from a sort of top-down, but also from a peer-to-peer. So you may be a teacher in a fifth grade classroom in Idaho struggling with a certain challenge, whether it's literacy or numeracy, and being part of a network like this and being able to dig into the results, both quantitative and qualitative, from peers from across the country or from across the state, can be really effective. I'm not arguing that peer-to-peer is the only way to go, but I think, Betsy, to your question of, are there other models? Do we have to go with some sort of, multi-month or multi-year, six-figure rapid cycle evaluation, rapid in quotes? Ideally, great, you've got lots of funding to support that kind of research, but there are other approaches as well.
Great, terrific. So Wendy in the chat area there asks, how important is the ESSA rating on choosing EdTech products for purchase by your school or district? So talk a little bit more, if you could, about how that evidence for ESSA is shaping things. Jen, do you guys look at that very much? Is that something that's a point of conversation in Chicago?
I'm sure it's a point of conversation at the district level, but we really work with school teams, and so it's not a conversation that we are a part of very often.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Malvika or Doug, anything you want to add to that?
Not really. I mean, I think the ESSA requirement is sound and reinforces best practices. So, I mean, not a lot should have changed, I'll say that.
Yeah. Malvika, let me ask you a hard question as someone in a company. I mean, there's often the suggestion, and one of the people in the chat panel made it, that third-party studies, can be very subject to interpretation. Someone goes and hires a big fancy research firm and they manage to get a study that says, gosh, their product is great, or somehow it highlights that element of the product that's great. So I guess it's a two-part question. One is, have you guys at Newsela ever done an efficacy trial that said, hey, this portion of what you're doing doesn't work? And do how much confidence should we have in some of these third parties?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I think we've just come off of 2 third-party studies that were answering very different questions. One was with WestEd, which is a fairly premier name in the research space. They've been doing research for the last 17 years and are considered sort of the gold standard. And then the other was Empirical Education, again, a reputable organization. And in one case, we were asking the question of, does this product work for all demographic subgroups in terms of impact and gains? And then we were looking at the data by demographic groups. And then in the other case, we were looking at fidelity of implementation. So I think the reason I say this is, I think we as a company will try our best and put our best foot forward in trying to partner with the right people. And I think because given their years of credibility and the fact that they don't just work for us, but have worked for so many other products, a district can go and look at their other reports for other products and compare sort of the kinds of claims they're making to make sure that they're valid. I do think that any third-party report validation is stronger than a report that I would publish, because that's me just tooting my own horn and saying that, yes, Newsala works. So at least that's giving it more credibility. In case of like whether it doesn't work, it fortunately hasn't happened to us yet, but that doesn't mean that it may not. I mean, like, going back to my former point, it really goes back on how it's been implemented and whether or not it meets the needs of a district. So I'm sure as we do more studies, there might be a use case in which it doesn't work, and that might be okay. For instance, a use case that we don't talk about as actively is students with reading disabilities. We don't have those supports on our platform. So that's not a group that we've studied, but I wouldn't be surprised if like we don't see dramatic gains there, and that's okay. That's an area of focus for us. Yeah.
Okay. Another question that I think really is relevant to everyone is that, as we've said, EdTech products are changing and changing fairly rapidly. What's the right cycle for collecting, whether it's peer feedback or third-party feedback, if these tools are really in rapid iteration? I mean, Doug, you talked about, using Learn Trials to collect peer feedback from other teachers. But you're also working with very young companies, and those are the ones that actually change the most and the most quickly. So could you give us some context around how are you communicating to teachers and teacher leaders that what might have been working yesterday, will it still be relevant tomorrow?
Sure. I think it goes back to that original question, which is sort of, this is the big ball of yarn to unpack, which is, what is efficacy? How do we define efficacy? And I think, timing is a big part of that. I have seen a lot of product demos that talk about, overnight changes or very rapid changes, and or we see district leaders that are looking for those kinds of really quick changes. We look at the challenges that individual students, whether they've got learning disabilities or, social emotional issues that are impacting teaching and learning. And, those don't change overnight. So why would we expect the sort of silver bullet effect of an EdTech product? But I will say this, I mean, there are some really promising models, and I know that that LEAP and other groups like that are working directly with school districts and EdTech companies, the kind of models that we're looking to do here, there is an opportunity to iterate very, very quickly. And so you're not waiting for months and months or years of product cycle renewals to look at potential improvements. I think the idea of sort of a lean approach or in the development world, an agile approach, I think is something that people should probably learn a little bit more about. The idea of, instead of setting out the timeline and going for months and months or years and years and looking for an outlook, looking for those smaller wins and seeing if there are initial measures of success, not as an end, but really looking at these as, it's almost the same way that we would assess children, right? We're not just waiting for the end of year high stakes assessments, we're looking at formative assessments. And I think we need to use that same kind of lens when it comes to looking at EdTech.
Jen, you talked about having the initial 4-week sort of experimental part of your trials before schools dive into a full year-long trial. I guess it raises a couple of questions, right? Number one is, do you get really different results? How indicative are those first 4 weeks of the longer experiences the schools are going to encounter? And then also that question to you of, well, what happens as products change and morph?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I would say that the initial response of teachers and educators and students too, because students are using the product, is an emotional response. Do I like the product? Is it easy to use? Do I think it will help my students with whatever concerns I have for their learning? And I would say that emotional response carries over to the full year implementation, that schools, if they like it, an initial gut reaction liking of a product in the beginning of the mini pilot, they'll like it through the remainder of the year. That's not to say that they don't offer suggestions for changes. And so one of the things that we do is that we meet with the EdTech companies that we partner with a couple of times throughout the year, and we ask source from teachers different suggestions, highlights of the product, questions about the product that teachers are still grappling with, and provide that feedback to the EdTech companies. And one of the kind of goalposts or filters for those suggestions that we ask teachers to consider is, what was your initial goal for using this product? What did you want to be able to get out of this product for your students? And will this suggestion help you meet your goal in a more effective way?
That's great. Let's talk about those goals. When we have talked with schools and districts and education leaders about, well, what are you trying to achieve? That question can sometimes be really difficult to answer. I'd love to hear from all of you, how quickly do school leaders get to a crisp articulation of what is the problem I'm trying to solve? And do they ever think they were starting to solve one problem, but actually realize eventually that they were trying to solve a different problem?
Happy to start.
Yeah.
I think I don't have as good a sense in terms of articulation, but I think something I wanted from the conversations I've had is I know that the first thing that I've always heard from districts specifically is that they want to see gains in terms of student reading gains. And then a conversation that gets missed or often sort of happens secondarily is student engagement. And it's only when we dig deeper and try and understand and uncover the secondary goals of the product that things like student motivation, student engagement, making sure that the teachers like the ease of use of product, those are all equally important goals for them. So I think often we think of one goal and it makes sense that that goal is driving reading gains, but it's been helpful to unpack multiple goals and set up primary and secondary goals so that in the formative feedback or the 3-month cycle, you can start answering questions like, do teachers enjoy using the product? Are students engaged? And then when you're looking at a year-long cycle, you can at that point be talking about reading gains, because 3 months just seems, you can do it, but you have to have real fidelity of implementation for that. A month is just too short for any of things like that.
I love that point. That's a great point. So sometimes the real relevant goals may be those secondary goals, and there may be a lot of competing ones. Doug, what are you hearing from your educators? And then Jen, love to hear what you're hearing from Chicago.
You know, and again, it sort of depends. I think you have some districts that are looking at wide pendulum swings. So they're looking at the end of year formative assessments. In Connecticut, we're a smarter balance stage, so you'll see those results. But you know, you're getting those after the fact, right? They're on to the next teacher. I think the better that districts are at collecting and acting upon more formative assessment data, the more they're going to be able to come up with goals that are more quantifiable and that they can articulate. I want to commend Malvika for the sort of secondary benefits, because I think it's a really good insight like that. The ability of a product to engage students and for the teachers to gain really good insights from it are all really important parts of you know, sort of how you measure efficacy and what those long-term goals are. I think you know, I think a sort of mature approach to this would be looking at groups and subgroups, looking at specific learning goals. Obviously, literacy tends to be a focus because the old adage of, you know, you learn to read and then you read to learn, that has an impact on virtually every other subject. So, you know, what I've seen most districts doing is being able to look at specific gains within specific subgroups. And then I think if they're able to articulate that, there's a much more meaningful dialogue with whoever their potential partner is in looking to roll out a pilot or a full-fledged implementation.
Jen, how do you see this in Chicago?
So what we ask teams to go through the implementation year is through the improvement cycle process, the PDSA cycles for improvement. And so those secondary goals that Malvika was referring to become the goals for the short cycles of improvement. But before any of that can happen, we ask teams to go through 6 months of professional learning before they even implement any kind of personalized learning strategy or the Edtech tool officially. And so during that 6-month ramp up to the school year, teams have to identify their why. And quite often we get schools identifying that they want to improve, state assessment scores. And we try to take them through the 5 whys protocol to get to the root causes of why they want to improve that and why they think students are not showing or demonstrating their mastery at the levels that they would hope for students. And so quite often things become goals and the root causes become things like Malvika said of engagement or students aren't experiencing learning that is culturally relevant. And those then become the goals for the implementation year as they go through the process.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jen, while we're with you, Lori Marshall here is asking, how is LEAP measuring the quality of the data and the usage, and are there any specific instruments that you like? And then I'd love to actually put that question to Malvika and Doug too.
Sure. So because we're a partnership third-party person, I guess, we bring EdTech companies together with schools. And so a lot of times the products have their own tools or their own definition of what is quality data usage and really how to use the data. But one guidepost that we offer are 4 questions. Is this right for this student at this time, and how do I know? And so it's not an instrument, but it's a filter that teachers can ask themselves to really identify, does this data, is the decision that I made from this data and looking at this data, is it good for this student at this time, and how do I know?
Interesting. Doug or Malvika, anything you want to add to that point?
I think in terms of defining dosage and the idea of dosage, I think trying to figure out, like, as an EdTech company, is like, what can we claim credit for is one of the questions we ask ourselves. Like,
that's interesting.
In terms of the fact of if you've used the product 3 times total and you see gains, that's chance. That's not working. And so something that we've realized is it's a combination of how many times you use it in a week, like the number of articles that you do, as well as how consistently you use the product, right? Like if you use it for 2 days today and then you're gone for 6 months and come back and use it for like 10 times later, that's not something we're going to claim credit for.
Kind of like my gym membership, huh?
Yeah, it could be your gym, but it may not be your gym. So in that sense, so when we think of implementing quality of usage, we think of it as both consistency of usage and how often you use it within that consistency period. So we say minimum of 2 articles a week for 12 weeks. And if you've done that, that is when we start talking about fidelity of implementation. That's sort of like the baseline, because that's the point we feel comfortable that you've used the product, you've engaged with the product, and you have a sense of it. This is assuming professional development and a bunch of other things. And that's how we sort of measure it.
Yeah. Doug?
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty with the 3 attempts and gains. And sort of on that note, I think maybe to echo something Jen said earlier, the 5 whys from the Lean Six Sigma approach, right? It's I'm not going to answer this directly, but sort of some advice to districts that are looking at solutions. I think one of them would be take that why into some of the underlying conclusions that, say, for example, what does an effective dose look like, or where do you see gains? Asking those whys can start to unpack things like, well, what is your underlying algorithm? I mean, what's the sort of math behind those recommendations? What's that based on? What kind of evidence is that based on? Because if you're sort of taking that at face value without digging a little bit at it, then it can be kind of challenging. I'm sure, anyone who's worth their salt out there who's providing really effective ed tech will be able to speak to those by subgroup, be able to speak to them by reasonable sort of dosages and talk to the correlation between those short-term and long-term gains and the use of the product.
Let's talk a little bit about the algorithms that are embedded, particularly in some of the more, quote, adaptive tools. And Jen, I know that you've encountered a lot of these, and Malvika, I would love to hear as much as you want to share about any of the algorithms behind some of the work that Nuzella's done. But what should we, how should educators ask questions to do exactly what Doug suggested, which is kind of unpack what are the assumptions built into a piece of software about whether it's usage and dosage, or even, more broadly, pedagogical practice. How much do we need to try to dig under the cover and understand what's in the box, as well as just look at what the effect of the box is?
I'm happy to start.
Great.
Absolutely. So I think this is a conversation that we have quite a bit. So for those of you who are not familiar, Nuzella uses an algorithm that we call the just right reading level. And that's used. So the more students read on Nuzella, the more we'll have a sense of their reading level, and we will recommend the text that's at their right level. In the context of this algorithm, we've done a lot of thinking around what is our role in a classroom, and we've sort of positioned ourselves as a co-teacher, as someone who gives the teachers the data that they need, but we also, we always believe that the teacher knows best. And so teachers have the ability to change the level for the students, or the students themselves have the ability to change their level. We don't lock them into a single level. And the reason for that is that we know that our algorithm is a recommendation, but it's not the final answer. That there's so much that we don't know about a student that's happening in the classroom, their background knowledge, their mood on that day, or what they want to read, that only a teacher knows and the teacher can adjust. So in the context of efficacy studies too, when we do the studies, we look at third-party measures or standardized test measures and pre and post on those. So like whether that's the MAP, the STAR, we use those as our pre and post measures to validate the efficacy of the product and not just rely on internal measures.
So asking what kind of measures a company is using to validate or to assess where the student is sounds like one kind of clue that we can explore. But just to push back for a moment, you said that you want to give the teacher what the teacher needs and that they're actually in charge. But if I've got 30 kids in my class and I'm using Nuzella because I think you can tune things a bit more, I can't go necessarily around to all 30 kids and sort of check those levels. So how, as a teacher, am I supposed to feel like I'm still in control then?
So I think as a teacher, either you trust the teachers have hacks at all given times, and within our product too, they have hacks. I mean, if they really want students to read at a certain grade level, they will make sure that the quiz only counts at that grade level, for instance. And we give them the data to see what level at which the students are accessing the text and stuff. And that's what I mean by that we play the role of giving them all the data that they need. So the teachers in their data in real time can see what are all the levels of text that the student has seen, read, how much time they've spent on it, and all that information is available for them to make a decision. So we have all the sort of controls that they need to sit in one seat and see what's happening. And then, but the judgment of what is best for the student is still in the hands of the teacher. Like that is the judgment we won't pass.
I love the idea of teacher hacks. Doug, Jen, do you guys see your teachers doing teacher hacks very much? And how do you feel about that, given that we just had a very lovely conversation about fidelity of implementation too?
I haven't seen a lot of that, but Jen, do you want to jump in?
Teachers are smart, yes. So I definitely have seen a few hacks here and there. You know, it's a balance that we're trying to live at LEAP, of fidelity versus doing what is right for students at that time, and giving students what they need. And so, it's a conversation with a teacher. If student isn't going to use a product using the algorithms using the data from the algorithms that they've been given, and it's just a conversation like, why do you think, what other information do you have about the student to tell you that they need to have some other reading level, for example, or some other pathway to get to numeracy. So we try to dig a little bit deeper into the why of those teacher hacks. And I would also say, to the earlier point about what tips would you have about in regards to the algorithm, one thing that savvy teachers ask is, how often is the information updated? So if students are given a reading level at the beginning of the year and that doesn't change, then that might not be the best product for the team.
That's great. We're coming up to the last few minutes of this webinar. So number one, if anybody has any additional questions, this is your last chance to get it in super quickly. What I've heard are a lot of really important things. I've heard us say over and over, we need to ask, on the educator side, we need to ask the why question, the 5 whys. Why are we doing this? And really kind of get to those multiple levels of goals, which I really love that distinction, Malvika. I think that the multiple levels of goals is really important. And then we are in a position to assess what tools might work for them. I think Doug made a lot of great points around shorter term assessments. And then this question about understanding the tools themselves, we've heard, ask what, as Jen just said, ask how often information is being updated, ask about the assessments that are being used, ask, am I getting all the data that I need if I wanted to make a hack? I guess the question that I'd love to hear you all reflect on just before we go here is, so what is one action item that you would really recommend to educators who want to have this efficacy conversation in their circles? What's the action item that should be on their lists? And maybe we can even broaden it and say not just for the educators, but also for the companies, for people who are entrepreneurs. How do they really usefully move this conversation forward in their circles? Would love to have you weigh in on that. Don't be shy.
I can jump in real quick. So I'm going to just keep breaking rules and maybe offer a couple of brief suggestions. We'll say they're connected, but one is I would just encourage district leaders to have a repeatable process. You may have different problems, but you should have a repeatable process for investigation. Malvika referred to the scientific method before. It's worked pretty well so far. So have that team-based approach where you're pulling in curriculum, educators, technology to really look at defining what those success measures should look like. And then the second part of that is, on the back end, don't just say didn't work, move on. Look at what aspects of that implementation or that pilot didn't work. Could be internal, could be with a vendor. If you can identify, the more you can identify where things don't go as expected, the more you can stop repeating those from happening in the future.
Great. Jen, what would you like to add?
I guess I would suggest to teams of teachers to really think about the purpose of the product, why they're going to use the product, and if it's for core instruction, if it's for supplemental, or refining areas for students. So what is the product? And then determining, does the purpose of me using this product match the company's purpose for developing the product?
Right, great point. And Malvika?
Yeah, I want to just build on what Jen said. I think continue asking questions and ask the tough questions. I think the more, as an Edtech company or someone providing the tools, if we hear all your goals and secondary goals, it'll help us do two things. One, it'll push more companies to produce efficacy studies and produce reports in formats that are helpful and actually help answer questions, so that when you're making decisions about products, you have all the data that you need. And then two, it'll also surface, hopefully, other forms of measures of efficacy outside of just standardized tests, because we've talked about these secondary goals like student engagement, student motivation. We don't have enough measures of efficacy for these things, and it'll help the industry in general develop those measures. So when we're talking about education, we're talking about the whole child, and we're talking about reading gains as well as engagement in the same conversation, and it won't be a choice.
I think that's a great point. Jason just asked a really big question, which has to do with whether we can look at this data over the long term, not just one time a year, but look at it over the long term. My sense is that that's really what we've been talking about, right? That, Doug, your point about we need to have sort of shorter things and look more in a more integrated way. Jen, I believe at LEAP, you guys are looking at the data all of the time. Anything anyone wants to add to that last point? Sorry to throw one last big question at you, but in the interest of serving our listeners. I think
That's a big one.
That's
a big one.
I think, Jason, you have asked a question that we should follow up with a separate webinar on and kind of dive into it in much more detail. But we are here at time, and I want to first thank very much all three of our panelists, Doug Casey from Connecticut, Malvika Bhagwat from from Newzella, and Jen Stack from LEAP. Thank you all very, very much. A big thank you to Newzella for underwriting and supporting this work. We will make this webinar available and hopefully have some additional follow-up resources that we can share as well. So again, thank you all very much. Thank you for caring about our students and for working so hard to really genuinely make their experiences as meaningful and as rich as possible. Thank you. And thank you everyone who participated today.